This place is dry, dusty, and mostly forgotten. It's called Badme, a tiny town on the Horn of Africa. But in 1998, it helped ignite one of Africa's deadliest modern wars. A war that claimed over 100,000 lives. But the story doesn't start there. It begins with empire, exile, and revolution. In the 19th century, Italy claimed Eritrea, carving it out of the Red Sea coast. Ethiopia remained free, unconquered, defiant, and proud. For decades, two futures grew side by side. Then in 1952, the United Nations drew a line. Eritrea was federated to Ethiopia, but not forever. In 1962, Ethiopia dissolved that union and annexed Eritrea outright. A war began. For 30 years, Eritreans fought from the mountains. Guerrilla fighters, many of them teens, battled emperors, juntas, and foreign weapons. And in 1991, they won. In 1993, a referendum made it official. Eritrea was now a nation, but the map they inherited. It was never agreed upon, because when borders are drawn on broken empires, there are always disputes. Now this one started long before the fighting did. Look here. Eritrea and Ethiopia both claim this stretch of land. You see this sliver here. It's called Badme, and both sides believe they own it. But why do these poor, dusty towns matter so much? Well, in 1998, Eritrean forces crossed into Badme, a wedge of land they believed was theirs. Ethiopia called it an invasion. And just like that, the unthinkable happened. Two African nations who had just emerged from colonial rule and fought a 30-year war. Together suddenly became mortal enemies. Tanks rolled, fighter jets struck. Trenches were dug, and within weeks, tens of thousands of men lay dead. What followed was 2 years of brutality. Mountains were bombed, villages burned, and entire families wiped out. Soldiers roasted their enemies' flesh over open fires. They hacked each other's limbs off, pitched battles, bloody ambushes, and assassinations in the streets. There were Badme, a place where Bedouin herders once raised goats under the British Empire. What were they fighting for? History doesn't say. But perhaps it's here, in these mountains, that we can find an answer. Somewhere among these stones, men once stood watching the sunset over a forgotten border. In 2000, the war ended. A peace deal was signed in Algiers. An international court later ruled. Badme belongs to Eritrea. But Ethiopia never left. And for 18 years, the two countries stood at a frozen border. No war, no peace, just silence. And then something changed. In 2018, a new leader in Ethiopia, Abiy Ahmed, extended his hand. Eritrea accepted. Families reunited. Flights resumed. And for a moment, it seemed like peace might finally take root. But history doesn't rest. In 2020, a new war broke out. Inside Ethiopia, Eritrea sent troops to help federal forces battle regional ones. And as they advanced, they pushed north, taking back territory that they say is rightfully theirs. And in the process, they raised a question. Does the past have a future? And we've been asking that a lot lately, because here in Badme, history is repeating itself. But to understand how, let's go back to the beginning. In the mid-1990s, after 3 decades of war, Eritrea was exhausted. Its people were ready for peace. They had fought since before they were teenagers. They'd seen friends and family die. They wanted a normal life. So when the guns fell silent, they voted overwhelmingly for peace. But while Eritrea craved normalcy, Ethiopia did not. The country's leaders feared that if they gave up territory, they would lose power. So as the peace talks dragged on, the Ethiopian military built up its arsenal. Eritrea responded in kind. Then came the border dispute. In June 1998, Eritrean troops entered Badme. Ethiopia mobilized its army, and soon the fighting began. Both sides claimed victory, but neither could claim all of Badme, so the fighting continued. Year after year, Both armies dug deeper trenches, amassed more weapons, and suffered more casualties. The Ethiopians outnumbered the Eritreans 2-1, but they couldn't dislodge them from their mountain strongholds. Meanwhile, Eritrea had few supplies and even fewer resources. But they had something else. They had hope. Not hope for peace, but hope for revenge. As the war dragged on, commanders on both sides grew bolder. They started targeting not just soldiers, but entire villages. If your neighbor insulted you during the war, now was the time to kill his family. If you lost a son in the fighting, now was the time to slaughter his killer's children. The violence spiraled out of control. Entire villages were wiped out. Men watched helplessly as soldiers cut down their wives and children. Pregnant women were burned alive. Homes were set ablaze. People roasted over open fires. Even dogs and cats weren't spared. Babies were thrown into the air and caught with bayonets. In the end, the fighting took 70,000 Ethiopian and 30,000 Eritrean lives. A whole generation lost. Their dreams, ambitions, and futures gone. All for land with no oil, no cities, and no rivers. Only memories. So how did this happen? How did two countries who had just emerged from colonial rule and fought a 30-year war together suddenly become mortal enemies? Well, part of it was power. Ethiopia didn't want to give up territory, period. But part of it was also pride. You see, for centuries, Ethiopia saw itself as the one true Christian kingdom in a Muslim world. It was ancient, majestic, and proud. Eritrea was just a colony. And when the fighting began, Ethiopia's leaders believed they could easily crush their enemies. Eritrea proved them wrong, and in doing so, they ignited an inferno. After the war ended, both sides kept digging in. Ethiopia refused to accept the international border. Eritrea refused to leave, so they kept fighting. Every day, soldiers faced off at the border. Every night, they exchanged artillery fire. Families were separated. Trade routes were cut off. Schools and businesses shut down. Whole regions became ghost towns. Today, Badme is still there, a name on a map, a scar on a continent. A lesson that when the past isn't resolved, the future becomes a battlefield. And those stories, they're worth telling because they shape our world today. That's 1 Minute. See you next time.